The cold winter wind howled across the North Sea on the night of February 2, 1943. In the darkness above Rotterdam, a four-engine short Stirling bomber from No. 7 Squadron RAF droned through the night sky, its fuselage heavy with bombs destined for Cologne. Inside the belly of the aircraft, behind a specially fitted bulkhead, sat a machine that would change the course of the war. The crew didn't know it yet, but they were carrying Britain's most closely guarded secret into enemy territory. At the controls, the pilot fought against the buffeting wind, his eyes scanning the instruments in the dim red glow of the cockpit. Behind him, the navigator hunched over a revolutionary new device. A circular screen glowed with an eerie green phosphorescence, displaying a map of the ground below rendered in ghostly electronic images. Rivers appeared as dark ribbons. Cities materialized as bright, sprawling patterns. This was H-2S radar, the first ground-mapping radar system ever mounted in an aircraft, and the Germans had no idea it existed. Then, out of the darkness, came the hunters. Oberleutnant Hans Dieter Frank of the 2nd Staffel, Night Fighter Group 1, had taken off from Gilsrieden Airfield in his Messerschmitt Bf-110. His radar operator had detected the British bomber on their Liechtenstein system. Frank maneuvered his heavy fighter into position, approaching from below and behind, invisible against the black void of the earth. His twin 20mm cannons roared to life. The Stirling shuddered as cannon shells tore through its wings and fuselage. Hydraulic fluid sprayed. Flames erupted from the port inner engine. The pilot wrestled with the controls as the bomber lurched violently, losing altitude. The intercom filled with urgent shouts. Fire, fuel, bail. The crew scrambled for their parachutes as the crippled giant began its death spiral toward the Dutch countryside. The Stirling slammed into the frozen earth near Rotterdam with the sound of tearing metal and splintering wood. Some of the crew survived. Others did not. But in the twisted wreckage, amid the scattered debris and burning fuel, lay something far more valuable than the bomber itself. The H-2S radar unit, partially intact, and with it, the cavity magnetron, the tiny copper device that was the beating heart of Britain's radar superiority. Within hours, German soldiers had cordoned off the crash site. Luftwaffe intelligence officers arrived before dawn. They photographed everything, cataloged every fragment, and then they saw it. The strange equipment mounted in the bomber's belly. Equipment unlike anything they had encountered before. They handled it carefully, reverently even, sensing its importance. By morning, the wreckage was on a truck headed east, toward Germany, toward the laboratories of Telefunken in Berlin. 300 miles away, in a concrete bunker beneath the streets of Paris, Admiral Karl Dönitz sat behind his desk, studying the latest casualty reports. The commander of the U-boat force, the man responsible for Germany's undersea war against Allied shipping, was watching his carefully constructed strategy unravel before his eyes. The numbers told a story he didn't want to believe. January had been bad. February was worse. U-boats were disappearing. Not in the dramatic fashion of depth-charge attacks during convoy battles, but mysteriously, suddenly in areas where they should have been safe. Boats crossing the Bay of Biscay were simply not arriving at their patrol stations. Distress signals cut off mid-transmission. Oil slicks and debris fields discovered days later. Something was hunting his submarines with unprecedented precision. But what? His U-boat commanders reported being attacked at night, in complete darkness by aircraft that seemed to know exactly where they were. The British called it Coastal Command, but this was different from anything they had faced before. No flares. No searchlights. A sudden death from the sky, striking with surgical accuracy. Dönitz had theories. His scientists had theories. They knew the British had radar. The Metox receivers installed on the U-boats could detect the long-wave radar pulses from patrol aircraft, giving the submarines time to dive. But increasingly, that warning system was failing. Boats equipped with Metox were still being caught on the surface and destroyed. Some U-boat commanders wondered if the receivers themselves were somehow betraying their positions. It seemed impossible. Then, the impossible was happening every day in the Atlantic. In Berlin, in a laboratory complex surrounded by guards and barbed wire, the scientists at Telefunken unwrapped the equipment recovered from Rotterdam. What they saw astounded them. Dr. Wilhelm Runge, one of Germany's leading radar experts, examined the device with growing disbelief. The transmitter was astonishingly compact. but it was the magnetron itself that left him speechless. He had never seen anything like it. German radar magnetrons were large, inefficient devices that required enormous amounts of power to generate relatively weak signals. This British magnetron was small, elegant, and clearly capable of producing tremendous power in the centimetric wavelength range. Wavelengths the Germans had believed were impossible to generate at any practical power level. He carefully measured the cavities machined into the copper cylinder. 9.7 centimeters, less than 10 centimeters. The implications cascaded through his mind like dominoes falling. At that wavelength, radar beams could be focused into tight, precise patterns. Detection ranges would be extraordinary, and most critically, receivers like the METOX, designed to detect meter-wave radar, would be completely blind to it. Runge prepared his report with trembling hands. The British, he wrote, had achieved what German scientists had considered theoretically possible but practically unattainable for years to come. They had created a cavity magnetron capable of generating kilowatts of power at centimetric wavelengths. This was not an incremental advance. This was a revolution that explained everything happening in the Atlantic. The report reached Admiral Dönitz in early March. He read it twice. Then he sat in silence, staring at the wall map of the Atlantic with its tiny magnetic markers representing his submarines. Each marker was a boat. Each boat carried 50 men, and now he understood why so many of those boats were never coming home. The British aircraft hunting his U-boats weren't relying on visual detection or luck. They were using centimetric radar. Radar that could detect a submarine's conning tower protruding above the waves from miles away. Radar that worked in complete darkness, through clouds, through rain. Radar against which his U-boats had no warning, no defense, no chance. He thought of the orders he had given. Stay on the surface to recharge batteries. Fight back against attacking aircraft with anti-aircraft guns rather than diving. Cross the Bay of Biscay in groups for mutual defense. Every one of those orders had been based on incomplete information. He had been fighting blind, sending his men into battle against an enemy that could see them perfectly while remaining invisible. The scope of the disaster became clear throughout March and April. U-boat losses climbed week by week. Experienced commanders with multiple war patrols simply vanished. New boats on their first mission never returned. The Bay of Biscay, once merely dangerous, had become a killing ground. Coastal command aircraft equipped with the new centimetric radar prowled the skies day and night, detecting submarines the moment they surfaced. It wasn't just the Bay of Biscay. In the North Atlantic, escort carriers now accompanied convoys, their aircraft fitted with the same radar technology. Convoys that U-boats had once hunted with impunity were now protected by an invisible shield of electronic detection. The hunters had become the hunted. Then came May. The month Dönitz would later call the Stalingrad of the U-boat war. Gun 854, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Otto Loh, was detected by a Liberator bomber from No. 120 Squadron while crossing the Bay of Biscay on May 19th. Loh never heard a warning from his METOX receiver. The first indication of danger was the roar of engines overhead. Depth charges fell around the submarine like a murderous rain. U-954 sank with all 46 hands. U-752, U-273, U-381. The list grew longer each day. 41 U-boats lost at sea in May alone. 41 boats, nearly 2,000 men. The loss rate had reached 30%. For every 3 submarines that left port, one would never return. No military force could sustain such casualties. On May 24th, Dönitz made the hardest decision of his career. He drafted a message to all U-boats at sea. Subject: temporary withdrawal from North Atlantic operations. The Battle of the Atlantic, which had raged since the first day of the war, which had nearly strangled Britain into submission, which had cost tens of thousands of lives on both sides, was effectively over. The U-boats had lost. Back in London, in a nondescript building on Swanage Street, the scientists who had developed the cavity magnetron allowed themselves a moment of satisfaction. Professor John Randall and Dr. Harry Boot had invented the device in early 1940, working in a basement laboratory at Birmingham University. They had machined the first prototype themselves, cutting precise cavities into a copper cylinder with hand tools. When they first tested it in February 1940, it had produced 500 watts of power at 10 centimeters wavelength, 500 watts. German magnetrons at the time could barely manage 10 watts. That prototype had been refined, improved, mass-produced. It had been installed in shipborne radar systems, in ground-based systems, and most critically, in airborne systems. The H-2S ground mapping radar, the S Mark III air-to-surface vessel radar, the devices that were winning the Battle of the Atlantic. They had known the cavity magnetron was valuable. They had known it needed to be protected. That's why bomber crews had been ordered to destroy their radar sets if forced to bail out over enemy territory. That's why the device itself was designed with a self-destruct mechanism. But accidents happen. Bombers crash, and once the Germans had a working example in their hands, the secret was out. Yet even possessing the device didn't save the U-boats. The German scientists at Telefunken could analyze the magnetron. They could understand its principles. They could even attempt to replicate it. By the time they did, it was too late. The Allies had already deployed thousands of radar sets. The production infrastructure was established. The technological lead was insurmountable. Timpe, in his memoirs, written years after the war, Dönitz reflected on that moment in early 1943, when he finally understood what he was up against. "We had," he wrote, "been fighting in the dark against an enemy who could see us clearly. Once we learned of the centimetric radar, many mysteries were solved. But the knowledge came too late to change the outcome. The examination of that captured H-2S radar set had revealed the truth. But truth, without the ability to act on it, is merely despair dressed in facts." The war continued for 2 more years. U-boats still prowled the Atlantic, but in diminishing numbers and with ever-dwindling success. New technologies were developed. The snorkel breathing tube that allowed submarines to run their diesel engines while submerged. The revolutionary Type 21 submarine with its streamlined hull and massive battery capacity. But these were defensive measures, attempts to adapt to a battlefield that had fundamentally changed. By war's end, of the 39,000 men who served in the U-boat force, 27,490 were dead, a 70% fatality rate. The highest casualty rate of any military service in the Second World War. They had fought bravely, these men. They had endured conditions that would break most people. Weeks at sea in cramped, fetid submarines. The constant fear of depth charges. The knowledge that if the boat went down, there would be no rescue, no survival. But courage, as Dönitz learned, cannot overcome a fundamental technological disadvantage. The cavity magnetron, that small copper cylinder with precisely machined cavities, had accomplished what thousands of escort vessels, tens of thousands of depth charges, and millions of tons of Allied shipping had struggled to achieve. It had ended the U-boat threat. In the decades after the war, historians would debate the turning points of the Battle of the Atlantic, the breaking of the Enigma codes, the deployment of escort carriers, the closing of the mid-Atlantic air gap. All were important. All contributed to the Allied victory. But many of those who fought in the battle on both sides would point to a different moment as the true turning point. February 2nd, 1943. The night a Sterling bomber crashed near Rotterdam. The night the cavity magnetron fell into German hands. Not because its capture helped Germany, but because the examination of that device revealed the true scale of British technological superiority. It revealed how thoroughly the tide had turned. It revealed that the U-boats were not being defeated by better tactics or greater numbers, but by a revolution in physics that had occurred in a basement laboratory in Birmingham 3 years earlier. The German admirals who examined that captured radar set in Berlin understood immediately what they were seeing. They understood that the war they had been fighting was already lost. The U-boats vanishing in the Atlantic weren't victims of bad luck or Allied brutality. They were casualties of a technological revolution they couldn't match. In the cold calculus of war, that understanding changed nothing. The submarines continued to sail. The men continued to die. But Dönitz knew, from that moment forward, that he was sending those men not to win a battle, but to delay an inevitable defeat. The cavity magnetron weighed less than 2 pounds. It cost perhaps $50 to manufacture, but its impact on the war was incalculable. Some historians have called it the weapon that won the war. Others suggest it shortened the conflict by years. What's certain is that when those German scientists in Berlin examined that small copper cylinder, they glimpsed the future of warfare. A future where technological superiority would matter more than courage, more than numbers, more than willpower. The men of the U-boats never saw the radar pulses that found them. They never knew, in their final moments, exactly how they had been detected. They just knew that somewhere in the darkness above, death was diving toward them at 300 miles per hour, and there was nowhere to hide. And it all began with a crash in the Dutch countryside and a small device recovered from the wreckage. A device that revealed, in its elegant engineering and revolutionary design, that some battles are decided not on the battlefield, but in laboratories by scientists hunched over workbenches, solving problems that most people didn't even know existed. The Battle of the Atlantic was won by sailors and airmen, by convoy escorts and submarine hunters. But it was also won by two university researchers who machined a copper cylinder in a basement, who solved the seemingly impossible problem of generating high-power centimetric radio waves, and who, in doing so, changed the course of history. When the German admirals examined that captured radar set, they didn't just understand why their U-boats were vanishing. They understood that the world had changed, that the age of industrial warfare had given way to something new, an age where the most decisive weapons might fit in the palm of your hand. The Battle of the Atlantic would rage on for 2 more years. But after May 1943, after Black May, after the month when 41 submarines were lost and Admiral Dönitz ordered the withdrawal, the outcome was never truly in doubt. The cavity magnetron had rendered the U-boat obsolete. The examination of that captured H-2 set had merely confirmed what Dönitz's casualty reports were already screaming. In the end, the secret wasn't really the cavity magnetron itself. The secret was how completely it had transformed naval warfare, while the Germans were still using technology from the previous decade. By the time they discovered what they were facing, the Allied production lines were churning out radar sets by the thousands. The war had moved on. The Germans were just learning the rules of a game the Allies had already won, and somewhere in the cold waters of the Atlantic, in the spaces between the ships and the hunting aircraft, the ghosts of those lost U-boats remain. Young men who went to sea believing in their mission, trusting their equipment, following their orders, never knowing that they were already obsolete, never knowing that a device weighing less than a loaf of bread had sealed their fate months or years before they ever climbed down a submarine hatch. That is the story of how a captured radar set changed the course of the war, not through any intelligence it provided, but through the revelation of just how far behind Germany had fallen in the race for technological supremacy. A race they didn't even know they were losing until it was too late to catch up. The cavity magnetron didn't just win the Battle of the Atlantic. It announced the arrival of a new kind of warfare, one where the most brilliant minds, working in secret laboratories, could forge weapons more decisive than entire armies. A lesson that would echo through the rest of the 20th century and beyond. When those German admirals examined that captured radar set in Berlin, they saw the future. And they understood with cold certainty that the future belonged to the enemy.